Yeah, of course. 1 second.
Perfect.
Yes. Wish I had a pen. All right. Somewhere here, I think.
Very good.
Yep.
No, you just messed up. It's got that slide.
Did I?
Yes.
Sorry. What have I done?
You've dragged that image all over the.
How did I even do it?
Right.
Right.
Needs to go back down there.
Is
Yeah.
that all right?
Yeah, that's that. Right.
It's not showing. Mhm. That's all right.
Okay.
Yeah. Go for it.
It's okay at my end anyway. Yes.
That's all right. The pen.
Is your pen
Perfect. Amazing. Go for it.
better? Yeah.
Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for today. I interest in molecular health there. And I'm sure many of you are old hands at the Society. Sorry. Many of you are old hands at the Society of Antiquaries, but nevertheless, there may be some newcomers here. And I'll just share a few words only on the Society itself. I'm Dr. Carol Bell. I'm the treasurer of the Society. So it's my job to give some oversight to the financial situation here. The Society itself was founded in 1707 and moved into Burlington House in 1874. And our focus, as is well known, is on fellowship, conservation, research, and disseminating our work to the public. We are a registered charity, and today our work is very much focused on those core objectives still. And we're committed to sharing our collections and our work with the public, which we do through events like this one today, through public tours, exhibitions, scholarly research seminars, and a program of publications. Last year, we also launched an affiliate membership scheme, and here's a leaflet behind that. And we have some of these available here. And what I suggest is that if you want to get more involved with the Society, have a look at that leaflet, and are not already a fellow, that is, then there's an opportunity to engage with us in that way. So it's my enormous pleasure today to introduce Professor Aidan Dodson, who has taught at the University of Bristol since 1996 and has been honorary professor of Egyptology since 2018. He's been a fellow of this society since 2003 and has been a Simpson Professor of Egyptology at the American University in Cairo and chairman of the Egypt Exploration Society. He's the author of more than 25 books, embracing both Egyptology and modern naval history. So can I therefore hand over to Aidan? Please give him a big warm welcome to speak about Duke Alexander's sarcophagi.
Right, good afternoon. Nice to be here to give what's turning out to be sort of an annual lunchtime lecture. Seems to be I'm tend to be the first one of the season every October at the moment. So hopefully I may be asked back after this. But anyway, what I'm talking about today sort of covers a couple of areas of my interest, which is both sarcophagi, things for putting dead people in, and also how ancient Egypt has come to percolate into the modern world. And particularly here, we're talking about the 19th century world. And the lens through which we're going to be exploring this is this gentleman, Alexander, Duke of Hamilton. who was a fellow of the society, and also was the Premier Duke of Scotland. In fact, the Hamiltons still remain the Premier Dukes of Scotland. And as he used to point out frequently, had things turned out slightly differently, he would be King of Scotland. There was at one point where the Hamiltons were one heartbeat away from throne. And just to sort of provide a little bit of background to the family, this is how they descend. And the key point here comes down to when the Marquesses of Hamilton then turn into Dukes of Hamilton. It then carries on down through to our man, who is down here as the 10th Duke of Hamilton and also 7th Duke of Brandon. Worthwhile noting, which is something which I'll highlight a bit later on, which has some importance to our story, is the fact that after his grandson, the main line died out and everything jockeyed back up the family tree for a while. And so the current Dukes of Hamilton are not actually descended from the 10th Duke, who was called by his contemporaries Il Magnifico. We'll see why in a moment. He inherited Hamilton Palace, which had been the seat of the Hamiltons going back to the days prior to them becoming dukes or even marquesses. However, this was a little bit too small for his liking, and this is what he turned it into. By 1870, it was the largest private residence in the United Kingdom, at the front view, and then looking the back of the whole thing. However, today there is absolutely nothing left of it. And just to show where it fits into modern Hamilton, it's now playing fields, the location. And why it's now playing fields is part of our story. But luckily, just before it was demolished, Country Life sent a photographer in. So we have some rather nice views of what that palace was once like, and truly palatial in its overall appearance. And by the time these photos were taken, it was actually shorn of quite a lot of the collections which had once been in it, because Il Magnifico was one of the great collectors of his time, and the palace was absolutely stuffed full of things. However, his descendants were somewhat more impecunious, and most of the things were sold off long before the palace came to its end. But just to give an idea of the kind of rather over-the-top splendor which the palace was engendered. Unfortunately, there, amongst all these photographs, is no photograph of a room which, as I will explain, is rather important to our story here, the so-called Egyptian Hall. Nobody ever seems to have got round to photographing it, which is rather annoying. But we'll see the things which were once in it. So anyway, so this is the palace. Now, the Egyptian side of things comes in 1834, when we find this in the records of Hamilton Palace, which basically it records the removal of a sarcophagus from out at Grangemouth, out on the Firth of Forth, all the way through the Forth and Clyde Canal to Port Dundas in Glasgow and overland to Hamilton itself. And this is the thing which is being referred to here. Now, the reason why the introduction of it is somewhat dramatic, in the sense that I'm just simply saying it's now being delivered, is that's all we know about that's the first appearance in any kind of Hamilton records of this particular piece. It goes from nothing about it to suddenly it's on its way. Luckily, we can trace rather more information about this piece from other sources. And in fact, we can trace it back to exactly where it started its journey to Hamilton, although we are unable to trace that journey before Grangemouth. Now, this sarcophagus is a man called Pabasa, and he lived around about 650 BC, give or take a decade or two. And where this thing originated was down at modern Luxor in the southern part of Egypt, which for over 1,000 years prior to Pabasa having been buried there had been the religious capital of Egypt, known better to many by its Greek name, which is Thebes. And here we have a map of modern Luxor. On the east bank was anciently the city of the living, where the main temples were, and the west bank on the left there was the city of the dead. And that is where this sarcophagus had been revealed a few years prior to its passage to Hamilton. And it's here, a place called the Assasif is where the piece originated. And looking down, taking a view of it here, looking down, and the tomb in which it was found, belonging to Pabasa himself, is the one marked down here as 279. All the tombs at Thebes have official numbers, which makes it easier to identify them. And again, the discovery of it is slightly obscure, but we do actually have in a manuscript in the British Museum this formal notation about this particular tomb, giving it its name, Assasafit Esunduk, near the Great Propylon in the Assasif. The Great Propylon is this thing here, where Yanni found a sarcophagus of granite. Although it isn't particularly informative, we do know that that is the tomb in question, and also we know that that tomb belongs to Pabasa, so it all ties in quite nicely. The Yanni who is being mentioned here is this man, Giovanni Danastes. I can never actually pronounce this. Just read it, probably easier. But he is one of a number of agents employed by the British consuls in Egypt to collect antiquities on their behalf. But in addition to collecting antiquities, which then pass into the consular collections, and then on, in some cases, to the British Museum, in some cases to other collections, these agents also used to collect on their own account, and Yanni was one of those. This is the tomb, tucked in amongst a number of other tombs of the same basic date. And they all have the same basic concept, although the size varies somewhat, in the sense that you have an entrance passageway leading down. Then there's an open court, or in this plan, a court of offerings. Then there is a set of underground halls. And then below that level was where the burials took place. Because these tombs, as they stand here, and you can actually, this one is actually open to the public nowadays, is not actually the burial element you're seeing, it's actually the chapel. So this is where people would come to place offerings for the dead. So this would always be open to the public in ancient times as well. But then there would be a deep shaft or possibly a passageway leading underneath this, which is where the burial itself took place. And therefore, it was underneath this structure that the sarcophagus of Pabasa was extracted by Yanni. Unfortunately, there are no plans of the tomb showing that lower level. This plan was done nearly 100 years after Yanni had explored there, and for some reason, they didn't actually clear the underground passageways. So we're not quite sure whereabouts relative to this bit of the tomb the sarcophagus was found. This is Pabasa himself, shown in front of an offering table. And also, the important thing about him, he was the steward of the god's wife of Amun, who was effectively the high priestess at Thebes during this period. And indeed, she was also the high priest as well, because male high priest had ceased to be appointed a generation earlier on. So she was effectively the ruler of the temples of Thebes, and as her steward, Pabasa was her right-hand man. And many of these great tombs in this area on the Asasif all belong to people who were working for the god's wife. And just a couple of views of where the location. There we are, that's where TT 279 is. And here we are going down into the tomb. There's this rather fine lintel when you get to the bottom of this, showing Pabasa, he's on the right there, along with Nitocris, tied in with various deities, including the sun bark of the sun god. And then from here, one then enters into the so-called light hall. Various other terms have been used for it, but it's the open courtyard anyway. And this is decorated with various scenes to do with Pabasa's job, but also to do with things he wanted in the next world. For example, he clearly liked honey. So therefore we have beehives and honey being collected. I don't think there's any other scene in a Theban tomb of honey being produced. So obviously this must have been something personal to him that he wanted that put in. So these kinds of structures, a lot of it is what you might call boilerplate, standard kinds of representations. But every so often one finds something which is a little bit different. And certainly the honey scene here, I think, is pretty well unique to this particular tomb. And then from here is where you then go properly underground. Let's say this isn't the burial chamber, this is part of the chapel. At the far end there would have been a statue of Pabasa where people would come in and recite prayer or provide him actually with food, real food and drink. This is very much the point of interface between the two worlds, the world of the living and the world of the dead. Let's say what's frustrating is that we don't know, we know this came from the tomb, but not from precisely where. And when you look at the plans, there are some pits marked, but the published section only has this unfinished one at the end of the sanctuary. And having checked with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, whose expedition produced this published plan, there's nothing in the archives to suggest that they surveyed further down. So obviously it came under the all too difficult kind of heading. So therefore we have this question of exactly where. One thing we do know, though, is it was probably quite difficult to extract, because this scar around the end, around here, is clearly caused by a chain having been wrapped around this to drag it up. But unfortunately, we don't know precisely where. And nowadays, the tomb is sort of nice. It's nicely paved to stop tourists tripping over. So there's absolutely no way of telling exactly where this was found. Although something which I would certainly love to do. Although this is quite an elaborate tomb, it actually pales into insignificance beside some of the other ones built at the same kind of time, largest of them all being this one of Pedi Amenope. And in this case, in addition to the chapel element, which ends here, we do actually have the burial element, which is, you see here, is an amazingly elaborate kind of thing. But probably nothing like that in Pabasa, one wouldn't have thought, but it does show that there are sort of two levels to these kinds of tombs. So the public element, and then there is the private element where the burial take place. So here we've got the sarcophagus of Pabasa. And what's quite interesting about it is it's very old-fashioned. If you look at most coffins and sarcophagi of this particular date, say around about 650 BC, give or take a couple of decades, they look very different from this. But the design, particularly around the trough with these images of deities, is something which had been fashionable a number of centuries earlier on. In fact, probably something like sort of eight centuries earlier on. And that's a feature of this period during the 7th century BC and immediately preceding period as well, is there's a great sort of harking back to the good old days. Art tends to become a lot more archaizing. And so they're looking back at a glorious past, because actually the 9th and 8th centuries had not been very kind to Egypt. So I think there's a degree of nostalgia, but you do find that manifest in these, in the design of these things. And in this particular case, these various figures here are various protective deities of the dead, almost standing guard. And then at the head end, we have got one of the protective goddesses, and at the foot, another of them. So all of this very much ties in with the idea of there being sort of a divine set of protectors standing round the body of the deceased. And indeed, this kind of sort of archaism is also to be seen in the sarcophagus of Pabasa's boss, the god's wife Nitocris, because the design of the sarcophagus which she was buried in was also of the same kind of date. Now, Pabasa's follows one particular style which was current in that period, earlier period. Nitocris is another style, but basically the two are really something which you'd have expected to find sort of 800 years earlier, rather than when they were actually created. Now, as far as the locate what was done with the sarcophagus of Pabasa when it arrived, it went here in the Egyptian hall. And so we've got no internal photographs of this, but that's where it is. It's underneath the portico here. So the whole acquisition of the sarcophagus is somewhat mysterious. So we can find it being dragged out of the ground by Yanni Athanasi, probably sometime in the 1820s, we probably think. Then it suddenly is turning up, being delivered to Hamilton in 1834. There is no evidence of the Duke having bought anything else Egyptian before that. Probably people normally start off with little figurines or something. You don't go straight to a multi-ton granite sarcophagus. Whether it was some kind of whim, how he knew it was on the market, we have absolutely no idea whatsoever. And this is one of these frustrations of the research around this. But you never, it's always possible in some manuscripts somewhere it may yet come out. Now, having bought one sarcophagus, he then acquired another one. We know a lot more about how he acquired the other one, and it was a complete accident. Now, the story here starts in 1836, a couple of years after Pabasa had taken up residence at Hamilton. And the Duke was in Paris. Now, he was over there seeing his eye doctor. He was also a trustee of the British Museum. And at that time, the British Museum was in negotiations to try and acquire a sarcophagus which was on sale in Paris. And the Duke wanted to go and have a look and see what all the fuss was about. It produced a rather greater degree of fuss than he might actually have desired. Now, the story as to why there was a sarcophagus in Paris at all and why the British Museum was interested in it goes back a little bit to back to Luxor. And there, in the temple of Luxor itself, were once two obelisks. And here we've got an early sketch showing them both in situ. However, both of them were then, well, one of them was then given as a present to the King of France. And in 1832, it was taken down and ultimately arrived in Paris and is erected in 1836. And as a result of this obelisk being removed, we now have this view And it's been that the Temple of Luxor has been likened now to being like an elephant with one tusk missing. Now that one of the, it was the only temple left in Egypt with a pair of obelisks in front of its gateway. And unfortunately, it's now in the Place de la Concorde in Paris. Now, having taken the thing down, the French engineers had to wait until the Nile level was appropriate to be able to get the obelisk on a barge and take it down the river to Alexandria and on to France. So while they were there, they did a bit of digging around, quite literally. And their digging brought them to this location, Deir el-Medina, which is a fascinating location because it's where originally the villagers who built the tombs of the Valley of the Kings lived. After the Valley of the Kings went out of use, it continued to be used as a cemetery. And here we have Deir el-Medina with this is the village of the tomb workers. Here is a much later temple. And then close to the temple, just here, was used as a high status cemetery around the same kind of time that Pabasa lived. And here we've just got a map. There's the village, there's the temple enclosure, and there is this location. And here a group of tombs were found. And one of them, which is now numbered DM2003, was discovered by the French engineers. And having explored it, they found at the very, very lowest level of this tomb, just here, a rather fine sarcophagus, which they recognized might be worth a bob or two or a franc or two back in Europe. And therefore they extracted it. And here it is. It's actually another god's wife's sarcophagus. In fact, the Nitocris was buried next door to her. This is a couple of generations further on, but it's another of these very, very fine pieces of work. And it belongs to the very beginning, so the middle of the 6th century BC. So it's a few decades after Nitocris. And anyway, because they've got a nice barge, it and various other antiquities are loaded alongside the obelisk, and the whole lot ends up in Paris, where they start trying to sell these various items, apart from, of course, the obelisk, which is due for the Place de la Concorde. And we start finding this happening. So first of all, the Keeper of Antiquities at the British Museum recommends it. It's a very fine piece, but the trustees didn't like the price. So okay, so they then make a counter offer, which is then turned down by the French proprietors. And this is roughly where we are for a stalemate, because the British Museum rather high-handedly says, no, we don't negotiate, we merely name prices. And so therefore the whole thing is rather stymied. However, clearly the whole thing is still in play, because then the next spring, while the Duke of Hamilton's in Paris, he decides he wants to have a look at this thing which they've been discussing. And this is and then some instructions are then given back to him. Now, at the same time as this is all going on, there's another sarcophagus in Paris, which is this one, which had been found a few years earlier, but again had found its way to Paris for sale. Now, this is the only known photograph of it. We'll discover shortly why it's the only known photograph of it. Hadn't come from Luxor, but come from the other end of Egypt altogether, from Memphis. Or at least probably the cemeteries adjacent to Memphis rather than actually Memphis itself. So here, Saqqara being the most likely place that it was found. And here we have a view of the of Saqqara as it is today. Now, over the next few months, there is a correspondence between the Duke and the British Museum. And here is a wonderful example of two group people not quite understanding each other, because the Duke is very much taken by this sarcophagus, which had been found in 1828, and starts encouraging the British Museum to purchase it, and says he can get it for a good price. Unfortunately, because the whole correspondence had started off with the Duke asking about the Ankh-Nes Nefer-Ibrahim sarcophagus, throughout this correspondence, the British Museum is thinking that the letters are all about Ankh-Nes Nefer-Ibrahim, and the Duke is thinking that it's all about this other one, which actually belongs to a lady called Irit Iriu. And this carries on, and eventually the British Museum, on the basis that they think that the Duke has managed to get them a bargain by getting Ankh-Nes Nefer-Ibrahim for the price they were looking for, they go to the Treasury and ask for a special grant to buy Ankh-Nes Nefer-Ibrahim. The money is then passed across to the Duke, and this is what we then read. So that should be 1836 rather. Yeah, so it should be 1836 rather than 1983. I have no idea why that's been mistruck. But basically, it turns up the crate is opened in great expectation of Ankh-Nes Nefer-Ibrahim, and it isn't. And they all get rather vexed. And I do still think there's a wonderful sort of 19th century. It's evident enough that the Duke has been humbugged by these rascally Frenchmen. Anyway, they write back to the Duke and they say, excuse me, Duke, what's going on, please? And this is what the Duke then comes back and says, I never said I was buying you Ankh-Nes Nefer-Ibrahim. I told you with this Greek basalt sarcophagus. And then he says very generously, well, fine. If you really don't want it, I'll give you the money back and I'll keep it. And the BM's response is, yes, please. Right. Let's have. I want that. Please send us a check ASAP. And then the problem is that, of course, they couldn't use that money to buy, even if they wanted it, because they'd gone to Treasury and specifically said not to be an Egyptian sarcophagus. They'd said specifically the sarcophagus of Ankh-Nes Nefer-Ibrahim. So what are they going to do? Well, basically they get the money is refunded. And in spite of the fact that they've always said that they will only name a price, they won't negotiate with anybody, they send somebody off to Paris rather rapidly and sort of to grovel and just say, look, we've got this money. Can you give us a sarcophagus, please? So, and finally, it arrives in 1837, having been bought for the grand sum of £640. It's worthwhile just noting about sort of what the values are in modern terms. So actually, given that something like this nowadays would probably be £500,000 at least, actually at this period it was quite sort of they could buy these things quite economically. Anyway, so the Duke now has a second sarcophagus, which he hadn't really wanted, but off it goes. And initially, it goes to his house in Portman Square. And it belongs to, say, a lady called Irit Iriu, the daughter of Torj, and she's about 4th to 3rd century BC. She isn't anybody who is otherwise known to history, but on stylistic grounds, we can probably place the sarcophagus around about this time. So it's about the time that the Ptolemaic Greeks are taking over Egypt. We possibly have the sarcophagus of her brother, but certainly a man with the same mother's name, said Irit Iriu, which was found at Saqqara, is now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. So, and stylistic, though that's more elaborate than Irit Iriu's one, it's actually very much the same sort of design. and probably from the same workshop. So we think we possibly can verify the idea it came from Saqqara, although unfortunately this one we're not even quite sure exactly where at Saqqara it was found, but at least it's definitely a Saqqara piece. And having graced His Grace's house for a little while, we're not exactly sure how long, but eventually it finds its way to up to Hamilton and joins Pabasa in the Egyptian Hall. So it's probably around about 1840, but we can't be absolutely certain about this. At this stage, the Duke is starting to think of eternity. He's starting to think about what should happen to his mortal remains. Up until quite recently, the burial place of the Dukes of Hamilton had been the old collegiate kirk, lying very, very close to the palace. But it was getting fairly ruinous and didn't quite fit in with the sort of self-image that the Duke had of himself and also the ancestral Hamiltons as well. And therefore, one of the great projects along with the building and the enlargement of the palace was to build a monumental mausoleum. Now, the old collegiate kirk, this is a sketch of it, had been built back in the 15th century and it had added to it a vault. Showing this old sketch here, showing the church and then the vault area, which was the burial place of the Dukes of Hamilton just here. You see the location relative to the palace. But this was then going to be replaced by something much bigger and more impressive, so which was a full-scale mausoleum. And the building of this kind of freestanding mausoleum, rather than simply a vault in the local church, it really kicked off in the early 19th century. The Duchess of Kent's mausoleum was often cited as being an example. And then, of course, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert build the great mausoleum at Frogmore in Windsor Great Park. So the idea of freestanding mausolea is sort of an idea for the mid-19th century. And here we have, so they're looking at a broader plan of the whole thing. Just well pointing out the sort of topography. This is the old church, which actually replaced the old collegiate kirk. Too many olds, so it can get rather confusing. This replaced the old collegiate kirk when it fell into ruin. And by the mid-18th century, the actual kirk itself was in a pretty poor condition. Although the vault, the mausoleum part of it for the Dukes, was kept up. But clearly, for somebody like Duke Alexander, being buried in sort of a lean-to on a ruin probably wasn't quite the sort of thing which he wanted. So therefore, this great mausoleum was then constructed. Here's a photograph of it while being built. Basically, what you've got is a huge sort of chapel area with this vast dome there. And then the idea was that the Duke himself would be buried here in the actual chapel, while his ancestors would have a new resting place underneath. This is the said mausoleum. I'm not sure whether or not anybody might have pointed out to him that the shape could perhaps be mistaken for something. But because when I've shown this to students, there's normally been some snickering in the audience. I can't think why. But anyway, it is based on classical originals. So this is the entrance to the chapel. Here at the back is the entrance into the vault. And it has an absolutely magnificent dome over it. And it's got one of these buildings where you've got a great echo in it. And you can go into one corner and whisper, and you can hear it around the other side. So it's a really quite amazing structure. And then underground is where these loculi were placed, which was to for the reburial of his ancestors. And it was intended then to be the hereditary burial place of the Hamiltons. And as far as he himself was concerned, he wanted to be buried, was going to be buried here in one of his Egyptian sarcophagi. And here is where it once lay. This is the podium in it. To lay on the top of there. The Duke had clearly got very much into this whole Egyptian thing. So even though, as far as we can tell, he never owned any Egyptian antiquities apart from these two sarcophagi. But he was getting old, and not long after this painting was produced of him, he died. And he had left instructions that he should be mummified in the Egyptian style. And according to one account, his last trip out from the castle, from the palace before his death, was to buy spices for his embalming. And the person who was engaged to do this was this gentleman, Joseph Pettigrew, who was the contemporary expert on mummies. He'd undertaken various mummy unwrappings around the country, and so he certainly knew more about these things than anybody else. And so therefore he undertook the embalming. Ancient Egyptian embalming traditionally took 70 days. He only took a fortnight over it. So quite how it actually, what he did, we're not quite sure. All we just simply have are newspaper reports saying that he did it, and not managed to find any kind of documents which whereby he sort of explains what he did. At the end of which he was placed in the sarcophagus on top of the podium. And here we've just got a photograph of that. In addition to the not being quite sure about the technicalities of what they did to him chemically, shall we say, there's a slight issue. This guy was well over 6 foot tall. Irit Iru was quite a slight young woman. And there are statements that to fit him in, he had to break his legs to fit him in. Another version is they had to cut his feet off to get him in. And even so, because they actually also then hollowed out the sarcophagus beyond. But somehow or other, he was stuffed. He was squeezed in anyway. And here he rested from 1852 through to just after the First World War. Now, what we know about the sarcophagi is really down to this gentleman, Colin Campbell, who was an early Egyptologist in Scotland, quite a pioneer of it in the north of the border. And he published this description and copies of Pabasa's sarcophagus. And he also, at the same time, he made rubbings of the one in which the Duke was actually lying, although he did nothing about publishing that at this point. Now, the death of Duke Alexander was marked very much what had been the high point of the whole Hamilton Palace and its mausoleum, because his son lived in France and Germany, and actually married a German princess, and basically spent pretty well all the money which had been left, and then sold off his father's collections to actually replenish his coffers. And his son, the last one of that particular line, died in Algiers at aged 50. Apparently also having lived quite an exciting life, shall we say. So therefore, with his death, without any male heir, the dukedom shoots right back up the genealogical table and then comes back to rest again here with Alfred Douglas Hamilton, who, say, has no particular connections with Duke Alexander and his immediate successors. And as far as he's concerned, the Hamilton Palace is something of an albatross around the ducal neck. He has He lives elsewhere. It's only used occasionally for hunting parties and things like that. But what is quite valuable is the fact there's loads of coal underneath it. And that is where a lot of the Hamilton money came from, was coal. And so therefore the mineral rights underneath the estate get sold off. Initially it's intended that these will make sure that the palace and the mausoleum aren't affected, but actually they are. And basically, once the mineral rights go in 1915, by 1919, everything is showing signs of subsidence, and then the whole lot is then demolished. At least the palace is demolished between 1922 and 1926, and the whole grounds go off to the local council, hence the reason why it's all now the local playing fields. With the exception of the old riding school, which is now Hamilton Museum. Now, as for the contents of the palace, most of that is then sold off, but the sarcophagus of Pabasa is presented to the local art gallery and museum. And it's therefore been at Kelvin Grove for the past century. There we have it in its current location in the gallery. Now, what about the mausoleum? Well, that starts to subside significantly, and therefore it is decided to evacuate it. Although everybody who's in there is dead, the view is they don't really necessarily want them to be buried under a pile of rubble. So therefore, April 21, they're evacuated. The 11th and 12th dukes, that's the son and grandson of Duke Alexander, are taken off to Broderick Castle on the Isle of Arran, and they are reburied in a small cemetery up on the hill overlooking the castle. Also, the widow of the 12th Duke is also buried there. But as far as everybody else in the mausoleum is concerned, starting off with the Duke himself and also his ancestors, well, they are actually all taken by cart across Hamilton to a field which has recently just been added to the local cemetery called Bent Cemetery, and they are all buried in a mass grave there. So here's a map of the cemetery, and this little corner, specially sort of annexed to it, is where they're buried. And we have this photograph from a contemporary newspaper showing the digging of a great big pit, and here it's being, I think it's probably here being filled back in again after they have piled in all of the various dukes who are listed, and their duchesses and so on listed on the right there. And also with them is Alexander still in his Egyptian sarcophagus. So underneath, so here we are, here is the area where they are. Here are a bunch of lead, wooden, conventional kinds of coffins, plus an Egyptian sarcophagus holding a mummified Scottish duke. And unfortunately, nothing really was done to try and record this piece. So luckily we do, however, have the rubbings, which Colin Campbell made in probably 1910. And these are currently going to be being used to basis for the publication of the sarcophagus, which was being carried out by myself and a colleague over in the United States. And the rubbings are good enough to be able to read all the texts which are on there. Not particularly exciting ones, merely sort of standard religious texts of the period, but these kind of things are always interesting to just try and see what's going on with them and how they fit in with contemporary material. It was thought that the whole place was going to collapse. In fact, it didn't. It leant like Leaning Tower of Pisa for a while, and then settled down something like 20 feet deeper in the ground than it was when it started off. So obviously very well built, and it's now in the care of the local council, local museum, and you can actually book to do little tours around the place. It's well worth doing if you're ever up in the Glasgow area. And here is the podium. And in fact, we're even sort of talking about possibly trying to make a 3D model of the sarcophagus, because trying to get it out of the ground with exhumation licenses and all that is just comes under the all too difficult, unfortunately. But it's sort of something which myself and the museum have sort of said, wouldn't it be nice if we could? So whether that will happen, don't know, but it's an idea. Just to finish off, however, of course, this is the real story of the sarcophagus. But what's really interesting is the way that legends grew up about it. Now, there's always this big thing about oral history and how useful it is, how much fact is in there. And this is quite a nice sort of litmus test, because we know, we've now managed to identify how much it cost and everything about how the sarcophagus came to be here. But then within a couple of years of having been placed here with the Duke in it, stories have started to grow. And it's just rather interesting to just pick up a few of them from the published literature. So we sort of start off with a dispute about the price. I suspect that's probably trying to cover the Duke's blushes, the fact that it was sort of this sort of comedy of errors. And then it gets, Iritiru is just a woman. By the fact she's got a nice sarcophagus, indicates she must be somebody of a certain level of society to be able to afford it. She's got no title other than Mistress of the House, which just means sort of a married lady. But rapidly she starts getting promoted to being a queen. He had the sarcophagus brought from Thebes. Well, the other one came from Thebes, so perhaps that's where this bit of it. And then by 1929, however, you've got a bidding war against the British Museum, and it's gone up from actually 640 quid, which is what they actually paid for it, up to £10,000. And then it becomes the daughter of Ramesses I, which not actually a princess, but this is now about over 1,000 years earlier than the actual sarcophagus actually dead. And then you've got this nice further one that turns out to be the court jester, allegedly. And just fine, and so and then the last one, I'm sorry, I apologize for the length of this quote, but this actually comes from an example of where it's all completely made up. The only thing which is probably true in that is Ma'aru is an old transcription of Irit, what we now read as Irit Iru, and Tazud is a 19th century transcription of her mother's name. But the rest of it is complete and utterly made up. Now, and the price has now been inflated yet further from 640 quid to 30,000 quid. It's just a really nice example, I think, of how an ancient object, even when you know all about it, can just take on a life of its own like this. And one of the reasons why I'm keen to sort of finally get around to publishing the thing is just to get the full story out. But say, really, Professor Gray, it doesn't exist. There was never an Egyptologist called that. Everything about this is all complete moonshine. But I think a really interesting sort of sideline on the way that antiquarianism in its worst form, if you like, can just sort of start producing stuff of its own like this. So therefore, I now leave you with the Hamilton Mausoleum with its rather sad empty podium, and the Kelvin Grove Egyptian Gallery, where we've got Pabasa dominating the whole thing. So thank you for your attention. I'll just go back to that in case we want to sort of just read the whole fairy tale.
Read at your leisure, yes. I'm sure there are lots and lots of questions here. This has sparked off all sorts of thoughts in my head. And but I think Aidan's point about mythology coming out of an object, even in modern times, is an incredibly important one, and underlines the importance of documenting documenting this object. So could I please ask for any questions in the room, first of all?
Can you explain the attitude to the authorities in Egypt to these items being removed? I mean, were they bought legitimately or what?
The early 19th century, what counts as legitimate or not is probably a little bit difficult. Certainly, I think as far as the Ankh-Sephra Bray sarcophagus, which came out with the obelisk, certainly, yeah, because the obelisk had been given as a gift by the Viceroy of Egypt to the King of France. I think along with a sort of add anything else you want to bring along with you kind of thing. Other things, it's slightly more problematic. For example, the Irit Iru, the fact the excavation was being carried out by a member of the Egyptian government who then clearly sold it on to somebody else. It's not really until you get into a bit later into the 19th century that the legal framework becomes clearer. At this period, there is a legal framework, but most people take no notice of it. It's really from the sort of 1860 onwards that we start when 1858 is when formal antiquities organisation is set up, and the legal framework really moves on from there. So it's a bit of the objects we're talking about here are in a bit of a sort of a rather nebulous state of development, shall we say.
Do we know if these sarcophagi were empty in Egypt when they were extracted?
I would say it's almost certain that they had been robbed centuries or even millennia earlier on. I think it's somewhere like Pabasa's tomb would not have remained unrobbed. Those are certainly the ones we're talking about here. There's no evidence they contained anything when they were found. They say they'd probably been robbed sometime. A lot of these places, particularly once paganism ended, the sort of pagan cemeteries were free places to do anything you liked. But also even in ancient times, robbery was pretty constant. And I think Pabasa, within a few years of his death, the Persians had invaded Egypt, so there's probably a good chance that during the Persian occupation that it may have been robbed as early as that.
Thank you very much. The Egyptian Hall at Hamilton Palace, it just put me in mind, its position under the sort of perron or steps leading up to the portico of the winter or Egyptian entrance at Stowe House in Buckinghamshire. And we know what that looked like. That was quite a sort of fanciful neo-Egyptian room, quite a rare thing in England. I don't necessarily think, it's a pity we don't have any record of what the Hamilton Palace one looked like, but it is quite interesting that they chose these rather sepulchral spaces to put curiosities like that. So
interesting thought. Yeah, it's a question of whether sort of who's influencing who. What date?
The Egyptian entrance is, I think, 1821.
Right.
Sir John Soane helping the
right.
then Duke of Buckingham and Chandos.
Okay, it could then, of course, then this would fit quite nicely with when the palace is being.
Yeah, and it didn't have any real Egyptian antiquities, but it had a stove in the form of a sarcophagus.
Oh right. Okay, that's very interesting because that sounds like that could actually be an inspiration.
I mean, dukes flock together. You may just find there's some link.
Absolutely right. I will investigate that further. Thank you.
The newspaper report refers to 4 canopic jars. Were they originally with a sarcophagus or prepared by Mummy Pettigrew, and were they reinterred too?
There were no canopic jars.
Well, thank you very much. Well, that's absolutely fascinating to hear of another country house connection. What came into my head was Wentworth Wood House, which does stand, but had coal mining very near it as well. Another giant palace, which has come down to us, fortunately, unlike this one.
Hmm.
But Aidan, thank you very, very much indeed. We've all been absolutely fascinated by your lecture, and wish you well with the publication that follows, and hope to welcome you back here very soon.
If you've had me back, most happy to come back. Thank you.
Very good.